Hello, everyone. It's Larry Kotlikoff. I'm delighted to be here today with Irene Chen, who is one of our country's top trade experts. Irene is a lawyer. She is a partner at VCL Legal. So if you want to go find her, vcllegal.com. And she has an extensive background in working for clients, but for about 16 years in her law firm. But before that, she started out going with a BA. What field were you in? What did you get your BA in?
Economics.
In what?
Economics.
In economics. Oh, marvelous. Okay. Okay. Economics at Columbia University. And then she went to Northwestern and got her law degree. And then she went to work in the government for the International Trade Commission,
Yes.
ITC. And then after a stint with the ITC, she went to work with the Commerce Department on trade issues. And I just want to give you a quick idea of, because we're going to talk today about trade. What the hell's going on with these Trump tariffs? And are they really in effect? Or are they on pause? How big are they? Who's enforcing them? Are they being enforced? What kind of what kind of uncertainty is being generated by these on again, off again tariffs? And what kind of an impact are they having on prices at this point? On the who's bearing the burden of the tariffs up till now, and will that change? All these really important questions that I think everybody needs the answers to. So I'm going to quickly summarize Irene's very cool CV here. I've got to see where I lost it. I seem to have, well, you know what? The I have somehow lost it for myself. Oh, here we go. Okay, great. Okay, so Irene represents, as I said, private clients, and she counsels and represents farm producers and U.S. importers on trade matters. So if you're importing something into the country and maybe also exporting, you're running into questions about what kinds of tariffs you should be paying, what kind of duties, and there can be disputes. You can be claiming that or being told that you have to pay this tariff, but you could say, well, look, my product's not what you think it is. It's three parts some other type of product. Its content is very different from what you're describing, and therefore our tariff should be lower. And that's an example of a dispute that Irene might be helping a company handle with it in representing the company to the government. But so prior to entering private practice, as I said, she was with the Commerce Department at the Office of Chief Counsel for Trade Enforcement and Compliance. So we're talking about somebody with really in-depth knowledge about how our government interacts on issues of trade, how it assesses tariffs, who collects the tariffs, the whole process, how do you appeal? And, but she also has intimate knowledge on a day-to-day basis of how this is impacting actual companies, foreign and domestic. And her work at the Commerce Department included advising the Import Administration Division of the Commerce Department on its anti-dumping and countervailing duty investigations and reviews and customs protests. It's not just tariff policy, but there's dumping policy where we can put on penalties for alleging that the foreign country is dumping products, selling products, could be sneakers in our country at a super low prices to try and take over our market. So that's an important part of trade policy and trade enforcement. And Irene also represented the U.S. in international trade litigation matters. So here we have countries kind of suing each other, and she's there in the U.S. Court of International Trade, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, the World Trade Organization, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the, all these legal entities that are adjudicating these decisions. Irene has had direct experience and still does, but now as a private attorney. While at Commerce, Irene served as a legal advisor to the Customs Liaison Unit of the Import Administration, rendering legal advice on matters pertaining to customs import rulings. And prior to going to Commerce, she served as an attorney for the U.S. ITC, the International Trade Commission. She advised the Commission on matters pertaining to injury determinations and anti-dumping and countervailing duty investigations, and then she was arguing appeals before the U.S. Court of International Trade and the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. And then she worked for a law firm, two different law firms let's see, one is Baker Donaldson LP in Tennessee, and then Ding and Ding in Taipei, Taiwan. And so is that an adequate description of your background, Irene?
Yes, thank you, Larry, for that introduction. Yes, much of my legal career has been focused on trade. And my career started out in the federal government at handling Title VII trade remedies, anti-dumping, countervailing duty investigations and reviews, as well as customs matters before two agencies. The first one is the International Trade Commission, as you mentioned, which it's unique in that it really handles quite specific parts of trade disputes. For anti-dumping, countervailing duty cases, it handles the sort of the material injury question of those cases. Are imports materially injuring or threatening to materially injure the U.S. industry, the domestic industry? And so it's the way it's conducted. It's a very deep dive into the economics of the U.S. industry, prices, costs, financial performance, volumes of subject imports. So it's really meshed with the legal. So it was a very good training ground for me to do the economic analysis and to really understand how the U.S. really views trade flows into the United States. The other part of the ITC is they also handle patent 337 patent cases, which involve infringement of patents and imports that are entering the U.S. that may be infringing those patents. And so I handled a bit of that. I'm not a patent attorney, but I did get some experience doing that. And so from there, I moved over to the Department of Commerce into the unit, the Office of Chief Counsel of Trade Enforcement and Compliance, doing the commerce side of anti-dumping, countervailing duty cases, as well as you mentioned, customs cases. So the interesting part about doing all of those cases was understanding the government's point of view on how to enforce the trade laws that are on the books and how policy is really intertwined with all of that. In fact, when I was at the DOC, Department of Commerce, they had an Office of Policy that weighed in on the decisions that the Commerce Department was making. So I think for trade, and I think we can see that right now with the Trump administration, is that it's really intimately intertwined with setting the law, coming up with the regulations and enforcement.
So let me, before we get into my next question about our trade policy, and it's gonna be a big question, tell me where you were born and how you got from where you were born to going into economics at Columbia and then going into law. Just give us a real quick idea about your career path, because I think I ask this of everybody because I think the career paths are so interesting, they're so different, and younger people that are watching the podcast, listening to it, may get inspired by people like you.
Thank you. I was born in Chattanooga, Tennessee. My parents are immigrants from Taiwan, and they they came to the US to attend the University of Tennessee at Knoxville for
Yeah.
their master's degrees. They were both in the science fields, chemistry and nuclear engineering. And so then they moved to Chattanooga, and I grew up in Chattanooga, but it was sort of an interesting, my background being in the South at that time and really embracing the experience there, but also having my parents who were from Taiwan, and they were speaking Chinese in the household. And so that's really, I think that's kind of what also led me into trade and economics, is the economics part, because my father became a businessman later, and I've always been interested in numbers and how that melds now with the legal side of everything, but also the cross-border and international aspect of business, and just how it really influences and impacts us every day. My father did import too as part of his business. He moved from being an engineer into a businessman, and he did import. So I think growing up in that environment, that sort of led me sort of naturally into trade.
Okay. And then, so here's my first question, which is, we're being told by this administration and by the Biden administration and the Trump administration before that, and other, I guess even the Obama administration, that we're being treated as a country unfairly by our trading partners. In particular, that China has been ripping us off left, right, and center, that stealing our ignoring our patents, stealing our trade secrets. Now, I imagine that this can be alleged about all our trade partners, and indeed, President Trump seems to think that anybody that sells us something that we can't make is doing us damage, and we should put up some barrier and make it ourselves. Uh, that's that's obviously going to be impossible for lots and lots and lots of products. That's why we have trade. It's like my getting upset over having a trade deficit with my barber, right? I'm my barber's I'm importing haircuts from my barber, and I'm exporting nothing to my barber. I'm selling the barber nothing. Should I get crazy? Should I put on a tariff on charge him for selling me haircuts? I don't get it. But as an economist, but is there any, just broadly speaking, is the U.S. being abused in particular by China over the years in your experience, or by any country, or just in general? Are we being victimized when it comes to trade? Or because historically we've had low tariffs, at least the official tariff numbers have been low before this current administration, and the average tariff has been around 2 or so percent that we're imposing on foreign countries, and they're imposing maybe a little bit higher tariffs on us on average, but they haven't been 50% or 100%, these kinds of crazy numbers that are being now employed. So what's your kind of general reaction about this whole America first, anti-foreign, has this been just kind of a political ploy to have an enemy so that we can now vote for me because I'll go after this supposed enemy?
I think it's kind of a complicated picture.
And you're a lawyer, so I know you're
Yeah.
not going to say anything that's going to get you in any. You have to be careful. So be careful, okay?
Yes, I think, and I see it with some of our clients, is if they're importing something, some certain products they import are not being made in the US, and likely will never be made in the US. And it could be issues from, it's just, you don't have the infrastructure here, you don't have the inputs, you don't have that certain whatever natural resource or something similar that you can get overseas. And the cost structure, the expertise is just not here in the US. I mean, when you think about it, it's a business decision, right? If you're going to set up a factory, if you're going to invest in workers and infrastructure, there's got to be a monetary benefit to that. There's got to be a return on investment. But does putting a tariff or a barrier to those products from overseas, is that going to create that opportunity for a US entrepreneur to say, yes, this makes sense now? Maybe not. And trade, I think overall, I think it has expanded. Remember, US importers also employ people too. And there are a lot of businesses and corporations that they import, and they are US corporations and they're employing US people.
I'd like to talk to you about a really powerful financial planning tool to help you make smart retirement and other critical financial decisions. It's a tool that factors in all your financial data and shows you what you can sustainably spend every year for the rest of your life. That tool is my software company's Maxify Planner. It's incredibly powerful, it's accurate, and it's easy to use. Maxify takes the guesswork out of financial decisions at every stage of life. Its focus is on raising, de-risking, and sustaining your living standard. Maxify lets you run what-if scenarios to see how your finances will change in taking new jobs, buying a home, doing Roth conversions, retiring early, downsizing, investing more in the market, you name it. Knowing the impact of these decisions before you make them is the secret to making smarter decisions. And it's also the secret to what we all seek, which is financial peace of mind. So please, visit Maxify.com today to start planning. That's Maxify with an I, Maxify.com, Maxify.com. Now let's get back to the podcast. But should we be angry because we're being mistreated? Are we being particularly mistreated by China in the trade domain? Or are US companies that operate in China having their technologies stolen left, right? I mean, do you have any sense that these allegations actually are true, and that they particularly connect to China? Because we have this really big China is emerging, and they're a threat to us militarily, or at least we've decided they're a threat, and they've decided we're a threat to them. And this is what you expect when power relations change between major countries. Historically, they get into either they cooperate or they knock heads. And when countries start to knock heads, they start to make up things. And the question is whether we're making up an enemy or whether we actually have a trade enemy at some level.
I think I probably wouldn't characterize it so broadly, like it's in everything. If for example, in the investigations that the agencies do, if they say there's been an infringement of a patent on goods coming in from China, or there's been dumping at less than fair value or subsidization, they take a very deep dive. I mean, they're collecting information on the ground. They're looking at the laws. They're very, very detailed. So if you have an investigation and you've done all, that deep dive, you've had everybody weigh in and then come to that conclusion, that's one thing. But if you just, do a broad brush on an entire country, is that supported?
Yeah, I mean,
so I think
have there been more kind of cases brought against China, let's say non-politically oriented, but legitimate cases disproportionately? I mean, China's bigger, so you're going to have more cases just because, and they're going to have more cases against us because there's more interaction. But would you say that there's been a disproportionate trade disputes between us and China that are legitimate?
I think that there's definitely the policy by the US against China is definitely more rigorous. The manner in which, for example, in the countervailing and anti-dumping space, they characterize China as a non-market economy. And what that means is that the US believes that the Chinese government has its hands in sort of in the market economy, in every facet of the economy, and there's no market there, just a regular market to set prices, that the government is involved. And they also apply this classification to Vietnam, to Russia, and I believe Belarus and North Korea. So those are the countries that they view as this, the government has a disproportionate effect on setting prices. And so they treat them in a more rigorous manner in these
You say that would be
investigations.
justified. I mean, China owns all the land, for example, in China, the Chinese government owns all the land, so they're not charging maybe property taxes or they are subsidizing whatever. They can co-invest with companies to an extent that our country may not routinely be doing or be doing as often. So I can see that it must be more difficult figuring out to what extent China is differentially subsidizing particular industry that we're competing against versus how much help our so I can see this very complicated economics here and decision making,
Yes.
even
Yes.
having.
And it is interesting. I think maybe there's is the view of they're an economic competitor because they've really gained the expertise. I mean, China in making things for many years, and they've become quite good at it. And so the US may view that as, well, that's a problem. Now they're so good at it, and we need to get better. That may be influencing those policies as well.
So tell us about just the general situation now. Is there massive uncertainty about what tariffs and importers facing at this point, or is there things seem to be changing every day almost in terms of what tariffs are announced? The president just announced a 100% tariff on movies made abroad. So if a U.S. company decides to film a movie in France, and hires a few French actors, and maybe there's some maybe there's a British actor who speaks French, an American actor, and how do we tell? But a lot of the editing is done in the U.S. How do we tell whether this is a foreign movie or a U.S. movie?
That's the key question, because what are you tariffing? The movies are digital now. It's not a film, right? It's not a reel of film that's coming across the border. What do you tariff, and how do you enforce that? And how do you have the movie makers or producers report that, and to whom? The policies coming out right now, I think they're sort of being issued into the market, but these issues are sort of lagging behind. How do you do this? And that is key. I think for a lot of the importers, and also the just business people at large, there's so much uncertainty now,
So
and you don't know.
Yeah, this uncertainty, it's one thing to have a clear, you're producing a widget here versus there, and the US puts 100% tariff on the foreign widget, and therefore American producers of the widget aren't facing the competition, and therefore the demand comes to them. This expands their production. That would be the argument to increase US employment and output, if that was your goal. Now, of course, it's taking away from other things that we could produce that we have a comparative advantage in, and it's costing American consumers more to pay for a US product that's going to be produced at a more expensive cost, but at least it's a widget, it's clear. But here, if there's uncertainty about what exactly is being, whether or not I'm really going to be hit with a tariff on importing this widget because it's half made in 40 different countries, and then maybe I don't, and maybe it's an intermediate input into my production of some other widget. Maybe I don't produce that other widget because I'm not so clear what this thing is going to cost me at the end of the day, because I could import it but then get hit ex post with a big tariff. A year later, somebody could come to me and say, well, you didn't pay enough tariff on the intermediate inputs into your production, so then I maybe reduce my production. I mean, could this be boomeranging against US production in general, this uncertainty about the real cost of imports?
I think so. For example, the movie. So the administration announced this huge tariff on the movies, but where are the implementing regulations? Like, how is that going to be enforced? If you're a movie producer and you're making a movie overseas in Europe or in Asia or Canada, are you going to take the chance that your whole budget, if you say spent 50 million to make this movie, is that going to be another 50 million in duties? Or is it only going to be on a portion of that? That, I think, is where a lot of the uncertainty. It's normally with trade policy, that's been my experience, is that changes, especially policy changes, go on for a while, that you get notice and comment. If there's a trade agreement being negotiated, that goes on for years. So most of the time, not always, but you have some time to plan and you have some notice to make contingent plans if this doesn't work for you. But here, things are happening so quickly, and they're happening without the benefit of knowing, well, how's the government going to treat this? How are they going to just issue me a huge bill that I'm going to have to pay? And that's the thing about the government, is that they do have extra powers. If you don't, it's like a tax. If you don't pay the duty or the tariff on time, they can suspend your ability to import. They can do other things.
They can
So that's kind of the scary part of it.
Yeah, they can shut you down, put you in jail, right? For tax evasion?
In extreme cases, yes, there are civil and criminal penalties for evading the duties and the tariffs, yes.
So you could, yeah. So do you have movie makers are calling you up and saying, what does this mean? Is that the kind of, I mean, is it literally that unclear?
It is, because it's sort of, I think it's like making the sausage, right? It's like, oh, this sounds like a great idea. But when you actually try to put it into practice, how are you going to figure out the rules of that enforcement? And how are you first going to define what is the item? What if it's a service? If it's an electronic item, what is the value of that? If he's literally saying, okay, the finished movie overseas, that is the value of what it's going to be dutied or tariffed. And so, of course, then the producer has the incentive to like make it as low as possible, the value, and then the government say, no, whoa. How much did it cost to make the movie, right? And they say, okay, no, it's $100 million, you got to pay this. So it's very unclear. This is a new area.
So meanwhile, companies in the US, like a movie maker in the US might say, well, I want to shoot this movie over there, but I don't know how much it's going to cost me in this extra tax. So therefore, I may just not make the movie, or just wait for 6 months or a year to figure it out. Is that what you're seeing, that companies are holding off producing things?
Yes, be holding off on producing things, on investment, on importing, because they just don't know. And in some cases, maybe cutting people, because if you don't know what your costs are, if you can't project your costs for the next year or two, or if you have customers that they're not going to absorb that cost. If you have this extra, which essentially is a tax, but they won't accept the increase in price, and then you have to absorb it. Where's that money going to come from? It's got to come from somewhere. Either your profits, or you got to lower your own costs, or you don't do it.
Want more money, less risk, and a better life? Buy Money Magic, a new book by Lawrence Kotlikoff, Boston University economist, personal finance expert, and best-selling author. Whether it's education, career, marriage, housing, investing, retirement, Social Security, IRA, or 401k decisions, Money Magic delivers scores of secrets to raise your living standard. Financial journalist Jane Bryant Quinn says Money Magic is a must-read. Nobel laureate George Akerlof says Money Magic is quite probably the best financial advice book ever written. Financial guru John Malden says you'll love this amazing book. It's full of wit, wisdom, and startling paths to a better financial life. And columnist Scott Burns calls Money Magic a funny, brilliant read, offering wildly powerful, unconventional choices that can literally change your life. Get Lawrence Kotlikoff's Money Magic today at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and independent booksellers.
So let's go to Brazil. I mean, we have the, 50% tariffs on Brazil across the board because President Trump doesn't like the way the current government has been treating President Bolsonaro, who was the former president, and he's now just been tried and convicted. And I think he's in jail at this point, I guess. But we're putting on a tariff on all Brazilian imports, all products made in Brazil that we've been importing, 50%, massive tariff, when before Trump, it was probably 2% on average, 3% was the average. So we're,
Your coffee,
yeah, what's going on?
your
So
coffee,
tell me about coffee.
it's going to go up because somebody has to pay for that 50%. It's it's in the US because the Customs and Border Protection collects the tariff from the US importer.
So Trump makes this announcement, and the next minute, you said there's something like 60,000 customs duty officers around the ports, around the airports, who are collecting duty. And the next day, they start imposing a 50% tax on coffee beans coming in from Brazil. Is that what happens? Is that literally what happens?
Well, the way that it works is, so if you're an importer and you're basically ordering the coffee beans, right? And you're corresponding with the Brazilian exporter, and then you're getting the paperwork together. You know, the invoice, the commercial invoice, the bill of lading, the entry documents. And so when it's coming in either by boat or maybe by plane, you have to submit the paperwork to CBP or your customs broker. So an importer usually has a customs broker who handles the entry, the paperwork with the US CBP. And you have to declare the value, the classification, the country of origin in the case of Brazil, and what basically the estimated duties. And then CBP will review it, and then they will issue you basically a bill. They'll liquidate the entry, and then you have to pay the importer has to pay that. So it's a little bureaucratic. It's a little bit of a drawn out process. But the thing is that knowing that an importer, knowing that, they have to react because now their costs have gone up by 50%. And so they've got to figure something out. Are they going to import the beans? Are they going to charge it to their customer? Are they going to take it out of their own business or their own costs?
Right.
But it's a serious thing.
So if we look at construction in manufacturing, so the whole idea here behind these Trump tariffs, apart from going after trying to keep Bolsonaro out of jail, I guess, apart from that motivation, was to increase manufacturing in the US. Now, if you look at the Federal Reserve St. Louis data for construction in manufacturing, so we're talking about putting up factories and plant construction is actually down pretty sharply from back in, if you go back a year ago, we're down a good, from like, I guess whatever the units are, these are $240 billion down to 226 billion. So it's not actually going up. This has not led to expansion of a construction and manufacturing, and I don't know what's happened to employment in manufacturing, but I don't think it's grown dramatically. So this is so far not turning manufacturing around, but manufacturing used to be, I think it used to comprise about 25 to 30% back around the end of World War II, 1945 or so, or maybe go 1950, about 45%, let's say about 25, 30% of the total workforce. Today, it's about 7%. So this idea of going back to being a manufacturing country and going from 7% of the workforce to perhaps at most 25%, that would take a long time, and we would have much higher costs than other countries. This is like shooting ourselves in the head economically, because we just can't compete. We can't produce shoes at like 98%, I guess, of our shoes are produced abroad. Maybe all 100% are produced abroad. So shoes would cost probably 5 times as much as they now do.
Yes, it's interesting. For example, you mentioned that the construction is down. Even in the parts like lumber, a lot of the lumber comes from Canada because they have a lot of forests and trees, and
right.
So softwood lumber. And so if that's being tariffed, that's slowing down that trade flow. That affects construction. There's all sorts of effects. It's trickling down. It sort of has a lot of intended and unintended effects. And as far as manufacturing as a whole, just my experience in working with my clients, it's just not that you just can't throw up a factory. I mean, it takes, first of all, you have to be able to project that you're going to make money from that. And some of these things, and it's interesting, like the manufacturing expertise too, that takes a lot of time too, because it's a lot of trial and error to do that, but maybe before you build a giant factory. So you need time to do that if they were to do that. Because there are some companies that have decided to see if they can open a factory here in the US. But there's a cost benefit to that too. Does it make sense? Some of them are looking for economic incentives from the state and local governments, like some sort of I don't know, say subsidy or something, in order to offset the cost, because it's significant and it's a risk. But that all takes a lot of time. So it's not as though you could tariff something overnight and then manufacturing will suddenly appear that quickly. No, these things take years.
And then you have to worry about whether the component, the building of the factory, if you need the wood to build, the concrete form, have the forms to pour the concrete, and the wood's going to cost twice as much or 25% more 6 months from now when you start to buy the wood, bring the wood in from Canada, and then now there's going to be another tariff, fight with Canada because the president has decided he's upset with Canada again. Geez, so are your clients like throwing their hands up, or what? Are they just pulling back? Are they desperate, going out of business?
Yes, there's some of that, and there is some of the wait and see, kind of a wait and see mode, a sort of attempting to mitigate. So if maybe they're sourcing from one country and they're looking to source from another country. So instead of building here, especially you have some sort of lower value commodity products, paper products, some cheaper metal products, they're not going to be made here because they just don't, there's no cost benefit to that. The cost benefit is too bad, it's too high. The cost is too high relative to the benefit. And so they're looking at other countries to source from. So I'm not seeing a sudden flood of attempting to move to the US for manufacturing. There is a little bit of that, but it has to be, it has a high dollar, a high value item that can be that they could probably replicate pretty easily the manufacturing. So it's a small subset.
Right. And then if you're, I guess, let's say a company that maybe hasn't produced here and is now going to produce set up a factory to produce a particular product, you want to bring in expertise, foreign workers who are super knowledgeable about how to produce that product so they can train American workers. And now these are being given a hard time coming into the country to work here. And then they're also wondering, even if they do get a visa, they may be thinking over two times over whether or not this is a safe place to stay, because they might get locked up at some point and sent back inappropriately.
It's interesting. When I talk to some foreign counterparts, they really, part of the view of the US is that there are actually quite a lot of barriers. There's legal barriers, and like you said, with bringing in expertise from the parent company to train the workers here. And all of those things factor into a business decision. And so because we're living in the US, we're sort of, I think, more used to the legal system, but overseas, they're looking at it from the point of view of, oh, things are really getting very strict. There's a lot of barriers there. Should we even continue in the US market? There's also that consideration too. Do they want to expend the fees, the costs, the risks of trying to set up in the US and bring in expertise from the factory? Can they do that? They might apply and they may or may not get the visa. All of those things. Yeah, those are considerations. I mean, it's a business decision. And
Right.
It's interesting to me in working with other countries, and I see it in certain countries, certain things are very bureaucratic, like really bureaucratic. You have to go through 7 agencies to get something done. And I do notice that the US, relatively speaking, it's easier to, incorporate a business, incorporate a company, start getting, hiring people, I wonder if that's been a lot of the growth in the US economy because you don't have to go through
So now you're
7
saying,
different agencies and doing all and getting stamped everywhere. And I wonder, that's been an advantage for the US for a long time.
we might be losing. Now, let me ask you a question about the Brazilian coffee beans. They could be put in a truck and sent over to Costa Rica, right? And those beans, and then put into a Costa Rican bags or whatever, bags that say Costa Rica, made in Costa Rica, and shipped. That must be happening, right? There's a way to get around this. And then I import the coffee beans and then sell them in my, sell them to American companies or maybe Whole Foods, whatever stores that are dealing with coffee beans. And then what happens if somebody goes down to Brazil, a US customs official, and sees that coffee beans are now being shipped from Brazil to Costa Rica? Do I get a bill in the mail for importing coffee beans from Costa Rica 2 years later that I thought were from Costa Rica, but the customs agents are saying, well, you knew that they were actually Brazilian beans and you were part of a illegal smuggling operation in effect. Is that a concern I have to have?
Yes, there is a penalty for transshipped goods. So transshipped means the beans are grown in Brazil. They're definitely from Brazil, and they're being transshipped through a third country, Costa Rica, before being imported into the US. And so there's a penalty of, I believe, 40% on transshipped goods. So you could get a bill, yes.
Even if I really didn't know, but I could be claimed to have known or should have double checked. Is that?
Yeah, there is a requirement the importer has to exercise, reasonable diligence in determining where the goods are from. I mean, it's not an absolute rule that you had to know no matter what, but you have to show that you made effort. You made reasonable efforts to confirm that these beans, coffee beans, were from Costa Rica. And so that's a big compliance issue for importers.
I'm a small boutique coffee shop. We have lots of coffee shops, and I'm importing coffee beans from Costa Rica. Now all of a sudden I have to start worrying whether these actually are Brazilian beans. I don't have the wherewithal to send somebody down and go inspect their bean farm. So I stop, not only do I stop importing beans from Brazil, I stop importing beans from Costa Rica. I stop doing business at some level, right? This uncertainty becomes compounded.
Yes. I find that a lot of the smaller shops, I think when they sort of decide to go out of business is when they get hit with the bill.
They just
And
go
it's, yeah, they because it's interesting, once you start importing, that's a legal liability there. And I think many don't realize that. And things don't happen for a while and they think they're good. They think they're in the clear. And then there's a statute of limitations, it's 5 years so they could come after you years later. And so if the bill is prohibitively expensive, at that point, they may just decide this is too much. I can't do this. Or if CBP, they do have labs. And if you have declared your coffee beans as from Costa Rica, but they have a special way of in their lab, the CBP lab, to determine it's actually from Brazil. You bring it in and then they pull the container and they check your goods and figure out it's actually from Brazil. And they send you a notice of proposed action and say, this should be reclassified as from Brazil. So please update your paperwork. And by the way, here's your new bill.
And if you say, well, look, I didn't know at the time I imported, I don't have a lab, I had no idea. And is that a legal defense?
Well, it's a possible legal defense to the transshipment, to certain penalties, but the bill, the actual amount owed on those beans from Brazil, you have to pay that because it's actually from Brazil. So it's not a defense to what it should have been charged, what the bean should have been charged with. But if there are penalties as to whether you knew or did not know of the transshipment, that could be a defense. But you can see it's complicated. Now the importer is drawn into the legal fight with the government.
Let's talk about retirement for a minute. It's something Americans think about regularly. Ask yourself, how financially secure do you really feel? Do you have enough money to retire? How much is really enough? And if you don't have enough money, how can you possibly find that extra money before you do retire? These are all tough questions. My retirement software, Maxify Planner, is the powerful online planning tool that takes the guesswork out of retirement. It weighs your assets against your fixed expenses to calculate how much you can safely spend every year for the rest of your life based on when you decide to retire. And it shows you safe ways to find more money. Maxify makes a complicated problem like retirement planning simple. It's accurate, easy to use, and produces what you really seek, peace of mind. So make the smart choice and visit Maxify.com today. Don't miss this opportunity. That's Maxify with an I, M-A-X-I-F-I, Maxify.com. Now let's get back to the podcast. So what's your take on this whole policy? Do you think this is just shooting ourselves in the head? I mean, are we going to get? Are you seeing left, right, and center clients and just clients that you've been working with for years that are prosperous companies? Just some of them are just really in distress at this point because not knowing what to do, facing things that are clear but clearly awful in terms of the tariffs that they're facing, and that they're just going to go out of. I mean, are you seeing clients on the verge of going out of business because of what's going on?
I'm seeing more distress, maybe a pullback in opening that other office, maybe a cap on employment, maybe letting some people go. I think with this whole situation, it's like a slow drip, because when the president announces a new tariff, that takes time to work its way through the system, right? That decisions start being made. Maybe the larger corporations can absorb it, albeit at maybe a higher cost to the consumer. The smaller shops, they're trying to figure out, are we going to keep doing this? Or maybe we're going to travel to another country and look and see if we can source from them instead of Brazil. Maybe we can find some beans somewhere else. And so they slowly start to make decisions. Maybe they stop shipments, cancel orders. And so so you may not, the effect is sort of over time. That's my experience. It's not an overnight, oh, everything's falling apart, because the government has to sort of, there's a lag time there between when you import, it gets entered into the US, and what customs may do. And remember, customs has to implement all of this. When the administration announces all these new policies, customs has to figure out, well, what are we going to do? How they got to put it in their system. Some of those things are easy, right? 50% tariffs on products from Brazil, but other things, we're going to do this for this particular product. Like, I think in addition to the movie tariffs, there was on kitchen cabinets and vanities. So now they have to recode everything. Okay, kitchen cabinets and vanities, and upholstered furniture. That also has gotten a new tariff. So yes, there's time. It takes time to implement. And so these decisions, business decisions, are made over time.
So if you're bringing the coffee beans in from Brazil, let's say, and the tariff gets announced to be 100%, was 50%, now it's 100%, and you've got the tariffs the beans are on the way. What tariff are you facing? You bought the beans thinking the tariff was 50%, now it's 100%. When the beans show up at the dock, are you going to be hit with the 100% tariff?
It depends on how the executive order was drafted, because in some of them they say if your goods were on the water before 11:59 p.m. on this date, then it won't be subject. Some of them say that, some of them just say it's effective on a certain date. And it might be too late to turn the ship around. In some cases, the importer could have it entered into a bonded warehouse and just re-export it back out, because we don't want to pay the tariff. We can't afford it. We didn't plan for this. So that's a possibility too. Or for perishable goods, I'm not sure how beans qualifies perishable, but there's some food items that you can't react. I mean, they're just going to go bad. So they got to make a decision there too. Are they going to have it enter the US customs territory and then they're going to be on the hook for the duty, for the tariffs, or are they just going to destroy the shipment, or maybe try to re-export? Hard to say.
If anybody is importing anything, if there's this uncertainty about, who would have thought that kitchen cabinets would be hit with 100% tariff from one day to the next? I guess it's any kitchen cabinet made anywhere. So how does this happen? Why does President Trump decide that kitchen cabinets deserve 100% tariff protection no matter where they're made from one day to the next? So if I'm importing, let's say, a file cabinet to sell at Staples, how do I know if I have it made? I made an arrangement to have it made in, let's say, Cambodia, and how do I know that it's not going to get hit with 100% or 200% tariff between now and the time it shows up on the dock? I guess I just stop importing cabinet. This can have knock-on effects, I think, across the board, because most U.S. products presumably have some foreign components as intermediate inputs, and so it can.
Yes, it's. I think that people are sort of holding their breath and hoping that whatever they're importing, that they're not going to face overnight some increased duty, but that is part of the uncertainty. If you're a business person, you want to have clarity in the next 18 months. And if you don't have that, maybe you don't hire that maybe you pull back on hiring, maybe you don't make that extra investment because maybe you have to have a cash reserve for these tariffs.
I see. We're only into the first 9 months of this administration, and there seems to be very little rhyme or reason. But what's the structure now of? We have these kind of we just heard about these 2 new tariffs on movies and on kitchen cabinets, but apart from that, we've got the Brazilian 50% tariff. Where do things stand in terms of the whole tariff setting? We've had these negotiations back and forth. Take Canada, for example. Are things settled with respect to where things are with Canada? Have countries retaliated in terms of setting their own tariffs? I know the EU, we have a 15% tariff on anything from the EU that we import, but I don't think they have responded with a tariff on us. But tell us what the kind of broad lay of the land is.
I think there are two tracks here. One is the negotiations between the administration and these countries. In DC, we've been hearing a lot of delegations from different countries flying in to meet with the administration, meet with the Secretary of Commerce and the U.S. Trade Representative. And so I think these negotiations are ongoing. So there was announcement of some very high tariffs, and then they were suspended or delayed while there were negotiations going on. And so that's one track, but there's no deadline on that, right? I mean, for certain countries, they keep pushing out the deadline, but it seems that these are not hard deadlines. On the other side of it, for example, the IEEPA tariffs, the reciprocal tariffs, those are being challenged in courts. And the Court of International Trade in late May issued an opinion declaring the IEEPA tariffs unlawful. That was appealed to the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, who right before Labor Day issued an opinion also affirming the Court of International Trade's opinion that those are unlawful.
These are most of the tariffs that have been levied for emergency purposes have been declared by 2 courts as illegal. Now it's going to the Supreme Court.
Yes.
And what you're saying is that the Supreme Court could decide, I guess, pretty quickly, within a few weeks, that all these tariffs that have been, including the 50% tariff on Brazil, the 50%, because not sure how high the tariff is on China. I think it's around 50% as well, that these tariffs are all null and void.
Not all of them. I mean, the litigation is going on now at the Supreme Court involves the IEEPA, the emergency IEEPA tariffs that were assessed on almost every country. And they also call them reciprocal tariffs. But
explain what IEEPA means exactly.
The international emergency. Yes, International Emergency Economic Powers Act. That act, and that was sort of the core of what that act meant. That was the basis for the overruling of those tariffs, because both the CIT and the Federal Circuit said, this kind of action usually happens like in wartime, or if there's an embargo, if there's something sort of extreme going on, in foreign policy where the president has to take action, maybe to prevent some goods from entering, or to with some enemy state. It's not designed to just be applied just without any restrictions to almost every trading partner in the world. That is not the purpose of that statute. That's what the courts found and said, there's the power to tax, and this is what tariff is. It's a tax. Is Congress's
Purview, yeah.
That's for Congress to decide. And in this case, the president overstepped the bounds by using IEPA to tax virtually every trading partner.
If the court throws out all these alleged tariffs, we have no tariff against Brazil, no tariff against kitchen cabinets, no tariff against movies. They all go away. I presume the tariffs against China probably also largely go away. The whole policy goes away. What happens?
Well, that appeal doesn't apply to these subsequent executive orders that apply to Brazil and the movies, because those are separate. Yeah. Those are separate executive orders. But if this goes on enough, there's likely going to be litigation, and sort of based on a similar reasoning that you're doing this, but is there any rhyme or reason to it? For example, the tariffs on India, because they import oil from Russia. Is that an appropriate basis to tariff Indian goods because they import oil from another country, from Russia? So all of these executive orders, they're vulnerable to being sued. They're being challenged. And I think if the IEPA decision gets affirmed by the Supreme Court, that's very strong precedent for these subsequent cases.
So what do you expect to happen then? Do you expect Trump to go back to Congress, the Republican Congress, and say, give me complete authority to set tariffs? And can that authority be provided just by a majority of the Senate and the House?
I think they can do that in limited circumstances, but it's all based on, if they're going to change the statute, because Congress, they issue, the statutory authority for doing all these things. And so that requires an act of Congress. And right now, things are very contentious, shall we say, in Washington, D.C. And that power to tax is part of the fundamental, balance and separation of powers. So I don't foresee that happening.
You're saying that Congress may not have the constitutional right to delegate this authority to the president.
Yeah, unfettered, right. Unfettered. Just sort of just a blank check.
It means Congress has to decide itself whether to pass a law to tax the Bolsonaro tariff on Brazil. That has to be a decision by Congress, one after the next. Congress has to vote on kitchen cabinets. And I presume at some point, even the Republican members of Congress are going to decide this makes no sense. This is the work of a madman, and we're not going to confirm it. I'll use my language here, not yours.
Well, it's interesting because the tariff schedule is set by the harmonized tariff. It's the harmonized tariff code, or the harmonized tariff schedule, which is literally a sort of just a chart of HTS codes which classify all the goods, because you have to have some way to classify anything: widgets, coffee beans, kitchen cabinets, right? Where do they fall? And so they don't typically say, well, I'm just going to just tariff this very specific item, just generally, because they probably say it's by tariff, by HTS code, or by country.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So yes, I don't foresee that Congress say, okay, well, you can have a blank check to do this. I don't see that.
So we will see to what extent Trump has the Supreme Court truly in his pocket, because in some ways if they judge in Trump's favor, this is abrogating the Constitution, the separation of powers, seems to me. I don't want to, again, put words in your mouth. But Irene, is there anything that, first of all, I want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast, Economics Matters podcast today, to talk about this. But is there anything we've left out? Anything major we haven't discussed in this area that people should know about?
Well, I think with my clients and people that come and talk to me about trade, my general advice is to, even if you don't have a big compliance department to figure out every little thing, that you stay informed and that you stay proactive. If you're going to do the importing and be firmly committed to that you need to get the information. And that way you can, even if you can't completely eradicate the risk, just do as much as you can to mitigate the risk. Because there are people that come to us and they had no idea that this was in place, that they had this risk, or they do things that I think really are not smart. They do things, they misclassify, and then they have an employee that goes to the government and says, look, my boss is doing this misclassification. Because remember, this administration, they're encouraging this whistleblowing because they don't have all the resources to go after all the importers that are not doing things correctly. And so you really got to be defensive about it. Yeah.
Jeez, what a situation. Okay. Irene Chen from vcllegal.com law firm. Let me just say, Irene is your lawyer. If you have any trade legal matters, not that Irene and I don't have any real connection. I got connected with Irene through a third party, trying to find somebody from the International Trade Commission to talk to about what was going on. So I just say this because I've had now this conversation, but we had another hour's conversation about these matters beforehand just to prep. And I know Irene is a super attorney on these matters, and it'd be great to help you if you need help. But that wasn't the purpose of the podcast. It was not to promote Irene, but really to promote knowledge about what's going on and where things are going. And they don't look good. Let me put it that way for both. Let me summarize it that way. So thanks again, and we'll stay in touch, okay?
Thank you, Larry. It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
My pleasure.